Hello and welcome to Champion Brief's January-February 2025 topic analysis video. I'm Daniel Shatzkin, editor of the Lincoln Douglas Brief, and today I'm excited to talk about our topic resolve. The United States ought to become party to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and or the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Now, before we dive into the topic, I do want to address some of the complaints that I've seen from the community, and one of them is very true. This topic is a little bit overdone, and combining the two issues together can create a large research burden, especially on smaller teams and on novices. I would also note that there seems to be issues on this topic from both circuit debaters and circuit squads, as well as smaller schools. I will say that these complaints are valid. I would also say that this topic has a lot of really, really good things going for it. For instance, there is a significant amount of literature on both the ICC and the Law of the Sea Treaty from both sides of the issue on affirmative and negative. This is because both issues have been debated about for decades at this point. And yes, I'll admit that because the debate is a little bit older, it's somewhat tired. I know I debated my freshman year of high school in 2003, 2004 on a marine natural resource topic that included the issue of the law of the sea. Rome Statute has been debated about on many issues before. But isolating law of the sea and Rome Statute together is a really, really good way for topics or for debaters rather to begin their approach to international relations topics. And it's also got a lot of evidence on it that can allow for advanced debates using critiques and different ethical theories and some kind of tricky affirmative and negative strategies. We're going to dive into both the affirmative and negative arguments surrounding both treaties, first kind of from a philosophical and ethical standpoint, that kind of combines both of the issues using the and approach onto the topic. And then we're going to look at it using the or version of the topic and look at the Rome Statute and the International Criminal Court independently under kind of more of a utilitarian framing. So with that in mind, let's start kind of discussing the topic. So there are a lot of broad philosophical and ethical questions that arise when considering U.S. participation in international treaties like Law of the Sea Treaty or the Rome Statute. To begin, let's first start with talking about the ideas of realism and liberalism within international relations. These are the two prominent schools of thought within international relations, and they look at the world in two different ways. Realism sees the world as anarchic, securitized, and one of self-help. So the anarchic nature of the world, according to realism, is because there isn't really a world government. There is no such thing as international law or anything like that. Each state is independently out for themselves and will ultimately securitize in their best interests. That means they'll join treaties potentially, but only do so when it's in their best interest. Power fluctuates. There may be one power currently at the top of the system, the international system of states, but that power can be replaced with another country or countries in a multilateral system, depending on how the world basically functions at any given time. Because of this, treaties and everything like that are circumspect, and everything that a country does must ultimately be in their best interest in the long term. On the flip side of all of that is this idea of international liberalism. And international liberalism is kind of like the idea of basically there being forms of international law and international governance that can control certain states and inhibit actions that could be detrimental to a world order. Entering into things like the United Nations and treaties that go along with the United Nations, like the Convention on the Law of the Sea and the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court, all basically promote this idea of international law, international order, international stability. That's where realism and liberalism really butt heads. Liberalism says that it is possible to establish a international system of law and order equivalent to that of a government managing, its own, say, states, like the United States managing its states and its citizens. There can be a world order kind of that can allow for each state to act within its own rights, but to make sure that there is somebody preventing states from violating another state's right. This is how the international kind of debates are very similar to the debates about autonomy and freedom on a personal level, right? The realists are very akin to kind of libertarians in their thoughts, in that each person has a set of uh, their own autonomy. But in the case of international relations, we consider that to be sovereignty. So autonomy is sovereignty in international relations. And it's basically allowing a state to act under their best interests and, controlling their own people, establishing their own forms of government, whatever it may be. Liberalism is kind of like those people that talk about, like, no, you sacrifice certain rights, certain freedoms in order to have order and stability within society. In order to have order and stability in the international world, there needs to be some sacrifices of things like sovereignty and state freedoms in order to promote global cooperation and the rule of law. Generally speaking, affirmatives will be arguing that joining these treaties demonstrates a commitment to global cooperation and that rule of law. It signals that the U.S. Believes in rules and international order and is willing to abide by the same standards as every other nation. No nation is above the law. Military power, economic power withstanding, there are certain things that every country has to abide by. Other arguments that tend to be both applicable to both UNCLOS and the Rome Statute would be things like moral leadership. That by becoming a party to these treaties, the U.S. can assume a position of some form of moral leadership, encourage other nations to act in a moral nature, and it will strengthen this international legal framework, because without the US present in this framework, there's no real teeth to it. There's no, if the hegemon in the world, the biggest power in the world, is not a party to these treaties, why should other countries follow them? And also, if the US is not a party to these treaties, then other countries dominate the international scope that the US is still kind of expected to be ruled by. Negative arguments on both of these topics generally will focus on issues like sovereignty, that's like the autonomy of a state. A lot of the opponents will contend that joining these treaties will impinge upon U.S. sovereignty just in general. International bodies will have some degree of jurisdiction over U.S. citizens, U.S. businesses, U.S. governmental action. We'll go into these a little bit deeper on an issue by issue basis when we start looking at the topic under a more utilitarian perspective. But functionally, the concern on sovereignty is there for these topics. And the opponents of both treaties, the major argument against them is that the U.S. will lose sovereignty and therefore will lose some ability to do something. But loss of sovereignty in itself is a justification under certain frameworks, under like realist framework, potentially to negate under the topic. And so, if you're going to try to use frameworks like international law and morality and things like that, you're probably focused more on the affirmative. On the negative side, you're probably looking more towards like sovereignty, maybe security, and those types of frameworks. Let's dive into kind of one of the key strategies here, and that relies on the words and or. Uh, Affirmatives under this topic kind of get a strategic boon just by the way the topic is worded. For example, if I am the affirmative and I choose to put in my 1AC both arguments in favor of the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea and arguments for the Rome Statute on the International Criminal Court, but the negative only responds to, say, the ICC arguments. They don't put any responses on law of the sea. It doesn't matter how offensive those arguments on the ICC are. If I'm the affirmative, I can concede those and say you still affirm the topic under the law of the sea because the negative no longer did not respond to why the law of the sea treaty is bad. So negatives have what is called a necessary but insufficient burden on them. They have to prove under a scenario like this that both the law of the sea and the Rome Statute is bad. Proving one individually is bad is necessary, but it is not sufficient enough to win the round for them. And this is a topically mandated burden. And this is why a lot of places around the country have decided to only choose either the law of the sea or the Rome Statute. And so when we start to get into each one of these arguments independently, it will become a little clearer why this is an unfair kind of argument potentially for the affirmative. And unfortunately, there's not much negatives can do other than take their time advantage that they have and answer back as much as possible on both of these issues and put offense on both issues when an affirmative does decide to go for both. I would say, as an affirmative, I would have, if you're in a region that is doing the whole topic, I would have a case that addresses the entirety of the topic for this strategic reason alone. And then I would have a smaller case that also maybe addresses either law of the sea or Rome Statute individually and use that in different situations for, if you're trying to maybe outweigh on certain advantages, like, you're facing a really strong utilitarianism debater, maybe just focusing in on law of the sea may be beneficial, or if they're a really good util debater and you want to make them go K heavy, you want to maybe run like an ICC KAF in that situation. There are times where situationally in those, whole topic regions, where you're going to want to pick. But affirmatives in general have a strategic advantage by defending both sides of the topic and putting offense on both sides of the topic in the 1AC, and then kicking the side that has more offense against it in your 2A, your ACAR kind of, your 2ACAR speech. And so that's the strategic kind of consideration behind the AF when you want to defend both of the arguments. But just remember that in general, this is kind of a debate on state autonomy versus international law. When we start to look at the UN law of the sea and Rome Statute independently, we're going to see that there are some differing issues and some issues that are actually interconnected. Let's first start with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea Treaty. This treaty has been debated about now for 5 decades, give or take, around 50 years. In the 70s is when they first started negotiating the treaty. Then in the 80s, U.S. ratification was being debated. And ultimately, the U.S. decided not to ratify the treaty, even though the U.S. is still a signatory to the treaty, which means that the U.S. president signed the treaty, but the U.S. Senate didn't ratify the treaty as one that the U.S. has to follow. It's important to note, though, that the United States does tend to follow the UN Convention on Law of the Sea almost entirely. We just don't make ourselves a party to the decision-making bodies within the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. And those are different ones that are for like mining rights and seabed territory rights and things like that. And that can become very important when we start talking about issues in the Arctic and also when we talk about issues in the South China Sea. Uh, right now, there are debates over various territories. There's the Senkaku Dayu Islands debate, where the Japanese and the Chinese both claim control over these islands. You have similar disputes in the Philippine archipelago, and I'm trying to remember the island there right now, and I'm blanking on it, unfortunately. And then also around Taiwan and the Taiwan Straits, and debates between Taiwan and China over control over certain territory and mining rights in in that territory. Similarly, also with Vietnam. And China and the Philippines. And so there's a lot of debate over territory in that region for mineral and seabed rights that are going on. And China is advocating for something called the nine dash line. And you can Google that and look it up, and it's a map. And it shows a line that is nine dashes, basically, that outlines the territory that China claims they control over the ocean. This has been rejected by the international bodies. But the United States is not a party to those things. And so China basically is ignoring these international rulings. They continue to build these artificial islands in various different reefs and stuff, in shoals and shallow areas, and build them up into artificial islands in order to further their territorial claims. This has been ruled as not sufficient by various bodies under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, which China is a party to, but they are ignoring the rulemaking body because there's really no other power within that body that is able to kind of stand up to China and say, hey, stop, this is wrong. Um, and while the US is doing things like freedom of navigation, sailing through various areas that China has claimed, and other countries are doing this as well, um, it's not really as effective, according to proponents of the treaty, as the US just say joining the treaty. And these navigational rights and access to maritime resources are kind of potential hotspots and flare areas for where conflict could flare up in the future, whether it's between China and Japan, Japan and Korea, Japan and the Philippines and China, uh, Vietnam and China, Vietnam and the Philippines. These are all potential flare-up spots for conflict. And the US being a part of the decision-making body and the adjudication body for these decisions could lend credence to some of them that China may disagree with and challenge China's growing maritime dominance in that region and kind of allow for competition to continue within that region that is beneficial to the United States. On the negative side on that argument would be like the United States basically is positioning China as an enemy, and that leads to conflict a lot of times. If you say someone's your enemy, if you say somebody is your opposition, they will automatically always be your opposition. It's hard to work cooperatively. But the argument for the UNCLOS is that it fosters greater cooperation because it allows the United States and China to work within these international bodies and establish better norms. Uh, the other area of growing concern that the Law of the Sea Treaty kind of can address is things like Arctic development. Currently in the Arctic, we have sea ice that is diminishing, that's leading to increased passage throughout the Arctic, as well as access to Arctic maritime resources. And debates over exclusive economic zones, who has deep sea mineral rights, how deep sea mineral rights are going to be divvied up in the future, all are going to be adjudicated through international bodies, right? If a US company and a Russian company both claim rights to the same, mineral deposit, how do we adjudicate that? And UNCLOS gives us a framework to do that on an international level instead of just having to rely on state to state discussions all of the time. It's a clear guided framework of how far the exclusive economic zone extends out, how far mining rights, how do you transfer continental shelf rights out into the deep sea. All of that is defined within the UN Law of the Sea Treaty, and so it can help avoid future disputes over maritime resources that are going to pop up in the Arctic. And any time that you deal with two nuclear powers having a dispute over resources, there is always a risk for war. And so these are going to be very large, big stick impacts. There's also some environmental claims within the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea about overfishing and how to, manage fisheries and who has fisheries rights. This is another issue where you have, again, China is doing things like sending large fishing fleets over to South America. They're not alone in this. North Korea has also done this a lot of times where they've sent their fishing fleets all over the world and have allegedly illegally fished in other countries' exclusive economic zones, and then brought that fish back to China or North Korea and not into, say, like Brazil or Argentina, where this has happened and has been accused of happening before. Um, it's also been accused of happening in the off the coast of the United States, and many other countries have made accusations of other countries fishing in their waters and kind of taking their fishery stocks. And so, law of the sea can help, uh, you know, solve this. One of the things, though, that people are against law of the sea for is that there is a cost to joining the law of the sea, and future deep sea mining rights would have to go into kind of this seabed fund, and the U.S. would lose a limited amount of control over that fund. As a party to UN Law of the Sea Treaty, the U.S. would be able to at least sway where some of that money goes towards an environmental, cleanup and this whole everything like that. They also would have more of a say in debates around territory, but they also would lose control. For example, if the United States and Russia, say, got into a dispute about territory around the Aleutian Islands, and how that would work, if the United States disagrees with a decision by one of these adjudication boards, there's very limited things that the United States can do other than just abide by a decision that they don't like. Or they then start violating a treaty, and that sets all sorts of bad international norms. Uh, the Law of the Sea Treaty in general, the biggest debates about them have focused on those mining rights and sacrificing of mining rights. Uh, if we're talking about the next 4 years, the likelihood that the Trump administration, uh, gets the law of the sea treaty signed in the Senate is fairly low, just politically based on where they stand. Um, but it does have bipartisan support. There are a lot of conservatives out there that view the law of the sea treaty as a way to control Russia and China's international ambitions, and as a body that the United States can use to help promote our best interests. On the flip side, there are also a lot of conservatives that sit here and say that it sacrifices mining rights, it gives control over decisions to international bodies and not the US government. And those things are just inherently wrong and dangerous. Um, you'll find a lot of that written by Heritage Foundation writers. There are several writers who have written on both the ICC and the law of the sea treaty together and make that claim. Looking kind of, towards why the treaties may be bad, asserting U.S. influence and control in another international body could just be seen as a way for the United States to continue to hang on to hegemonic control when other countries are kind of taking a more control over their sphere of influence, and that risks greater conflict. There are also some arguments about how the framing of that region as the South China Sea could be in some way kind of imperialistic or Western centric, but it is also debatable because China also calls it that. And there are a lot of debates on these things. There's a lot of debates about Orientalism when it comes to this, and about how the United States basically views the East, and the West in general views the East when it comes to their politics, and how the law of the sea treaty is really just a way to, generally speaking, re-entrench Western power and Western ideology within the sphere of influence of like Russia and China, and to keep Russia and China from being able to fully exert themselves within their sphere of influence. Moving on to the ICC and the Rome Statute. A lot of the affirmative arguments are going to talk about how it may actually deter U.S. participation in questionable conflicts, as well as prevent U.S. actors from committing things like war crimes and crimes against humanity. And I think a lot of these arguments, well, functionally may be true. There are some good arguments that basically say the US is already trying to follow these standards anyway, right? The US Uniform Code of Justice tries to eliminate officers arguing, ordering for war crimes and ordering crimes against humanity and ordering for genocides to be carried out. And that as long as we maintain the US Code of, uniform code, and how the military is supposed to act, it's fine, and we don't really need to join the ICC. Or even if we join the ICC, on the flip side of that, it's not going to matter because the US already tends to try to uphold the same values as the ICC. We'll talk about why that may not be true in a second. The second argument is that the US joining the ICC can help grant legitimacy to the ICC on a greater scale. Being a party to it means that the United States is saying these are the rules in which all society should live by, and that these rules can promote the justice for any victim of a heinous crime. It doesn't matter where. If they are a victim of a state sponsored crime, this allows people to find justice for it. There are some fairly reasonable arguments actually against the International Criminal Court. The biggest one is the politicization of justice. There are a lot of concerns that the International Criminal Court actually politicizes justice and can become a tool for political persecution and the targeting of U.S. citizens and military personnel. For example, under the International Criminal Court, a soldier following orders is just as culpable as the person giving the order. And so if a soldier unknowingly carries out a war crime, well, following an order that was given to them, they are actually culpable for that crime under the ICC, whereas under the U.S. Code of the U.S. Uniform Code of Justice basically would say that it's the officer's fault for ordering it, and the soldier who does not knowingly commit an act but still does something that ends up being wrong is not culpable for that act. It's the officer who orders the act that's there, that they're the ones that should be facing trial. There's a lot of opposition that argue that the U.S. participation in the ICC could then ultimately weaken the U.S. military because it subjects its personnel to international persecution. It means that the military is going to act, less decisively potentially because, they're going to be concerned about, a potential trial years later down the road, and they may not take the option that is best in that situation. Um, there's also issues on national security and whether or not, how the United States can deal with terrorists. And, in this idea of the politicization of the ICC as well as weakening of a military response, if you want to look at what happened with Israel, and I am not going to take a side one way or another, but the fact that both Israeli leaders and Hamas leaders are both actually being tried currently under the IC, or at least have warrants for them out under the ICC for various war crimes, I think is an important thing to note in that, you know, where is too far on defense? How do we do that? And I think there are arguments on both sides when it comes to kind of the Israeli and Palestinian conflict and the U.S. role within it on why joining the ICC could be both a boon or a problem for that region and conflict within that region. There are equal arguments actually on both sides for it when it comes to how the U.S. engagement on the ICC could affect that conflict. Looking at Ukraine and potential war crimes there, and how the United States becoming a party to the ICC may actually, help try some of those crimes are also very, very important debates to be had. And, there are a lot of different issues in which the ICC can pop up. Recently, both the ICC and the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea are going to come into play when it deals with the undersea cables that were allegedly cut by Russia or China, depending on which cable we're talking about, and ships from either Russia or China and connected to Russia and Chinese, military shipments and things like that, where they dragged their anchors supposedly and cut undersea cables. Both of those issues are going to be discussed by probably the International Criminal Court, and they're going to be discussing statutes of the Law of the Sea Treaty in that deliberation. And so ultimately, there are a lot of issues there at play. But there are legitimate concerns towards them and how they can affect U.S. security, how the U.S. military will operate, how U.S. mining rights can be distributed, how U.S. Seabed rights, our EEZ, freedom of navigation internationally. All of these are going to be affected by it. Uh, Whether you are debating the topic as a whole or on one of these issues, just remember that the philosophical justifications behind them are very similar to how we operate as individuals within a state. And the philosophical debates that we have as individuals inside of the state on freedom and rights and how far a government should intervene. It just happens on an international scale and on governing the actions of, states instead of an individual person. We've explored some of the philosophical, ethical, utilitarian kind of arguments surrounding these treaties. And I think I've highlighted a few of the potential benefits and potential harms of US participation. Ultimately, the judge's decision is going to rest on the careful weighing of all of these factors. How much does US leadership matter, or international legitimacy, or sovereignty, or security, all of these things matter in conjunction with the other. And how the US national interests and values are ultimately going to be bettered under a system of international law or a system that promotes state sovereignty. Thank you for listening to this episode. I hope you listen to our future video topic analysis and continue to subscribe to Champion Briefs.